So, Lone Rider here, and thought I'd share with you 10 things that you may not know about cycling, being a cyclist myself. First is that the chain drive that we see on modern bicycles may actually have been invented by Leonardo da Vinci. Now, this is a contentious thing. In 1974, a sketch surfaced that had been attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, showing a bicycle with a modern chain drive. This puzzled a lot of people because the first true bicycles, when they developed in the 1800s, had the pedals affixed directly to the front wheel, and it took a long and tortuous road of technological development to finally see the emergence of two discrete cogs with a drive chain linking them together. Many people wonder, well, if this is legit, how come we didn't have chain drive a lot earlier? And the answer is there's a question as to whether it may be legit or not. People say that the drawing actually is a modern forgery. Other people claim it's legit, but that it was simply concealed within the pages of the book, pages that had been stuck together and was only revealed during a restoration, etc. Nobody's really sure. The genuine consensus, though, is doubtful. Number two, gear inches once were a reference to the size of the front wheel itself. Speaking of the pedals being directly affixed to the front wheel of your bicycle, if you were a cyclist prior to the invention of the so-called modern safety bicycle with a chain-driven drivetrain and more or less equal-sized front and rear wheels, the only way you could make your bike have a more advanced gearing, go faster or slower for each revolution of the wheel, was to change the size of the front wheel itself. The term gear inches is now used to refer to the mechanical advantage imparted by the drivetrain of the bicycle, but at one point it was a reference to the actual size, diameter, essentially, of your front wheel. The larger your front wheel, essentially the more inches it contained, the greater your gear inches. Now, of course, it's a calculation used mainly by single speeders and other people who want to tweak their gearing, and mercifully we don't really have to worry about high wheelers anymore, except for people who choose to ride them. Next, the first mountain bikers were actually U.S. soldiers. Back in the 1800s, the bicycle was a relatively new invention, and people were seeing all sorts of ways that they could try and take advantage of it. One of those was to use bicycles instead of horses for military excursions. A group of U.S. military soldiers actually trekked across a large portion of the country, much of which at the time had no paved roads, and as a result, you could consider that these soldiers were actually the first mountain bikers, essentially. Of course, people have been riding bicycles both on and off of roadways ever since they were invented, simply because, well, many of the early roads weren't really much in the way of roads in the first place. A lot of them were dirt, unpaved, maybe macadam or gravel if you were lucky. But the detachment of American soldiers who actually went off-roading in the wilds of the West, I think we can safely say that qualifies as the first modern instance of mountain biking. Speaking of roads, a lot of people who don't bicycle, including some drivers who look down on cyclists and view them as a nuisance on the roadway, will be surprised to find that the roads that we take for granted in this country, the first modern, graded, smoothly paved roads, many of them were actually implemented at the behest of cycling advocates, including a cycling organization called the League of American Wheelmen, now the League of American Bicyclists, a cycling organization which has been around for over 100 years. Both bicyclists as well as cycling manufacturers saw that there was a demand for their machines, but that the roads that existed at the time were not well suited to riding on with fairly narrow tires. Hence the push to have a better and truly paved road infrastructure in the country. The irony, of course, is that most people today no longer remember where these roads came from, and as a result there tends to be a belief that the cyclist does not belong on the road. The irony is that if it was not for cycling, many of these roads would not exist, at least not in their current usable by modern cars condition. Next, speaking of tires and roadways, where would we be without the inflatable tire? It's not just useful for bicycles, but it's also useful for automobiles, trucks, motorcycles, landing gear on airplanes. One could argue that without the inflatable tire, most modern transportation, with the possible exception perhaps of railways, would not exist in its current form. Well, you may not know this, but the inflatable tire was actually invented for the bicycle. In particular, it was invented by John Boyd Dunlop, a Scottish veterinarian and tinkerer. He first invented the tire for his children's tricycle. It was then improved upon and became a fixture on modern bicycles before being adopted by automobiles and other devices. That's right, without the bicycle, your car would be running on Flintstones wheels. Number 6. This may surprise some people, but at the time cycling first emerged, it was seen as women's lib. Keep in mind, in the 19th century, the 1800s, social conventions were very different than they are now, especially as regards differences between the sexes. The bicycle was seen as a vehicle for women to get out and about, gain some independence, go on their own to places and do things on their own without having to be chaperoned, as well as leading to a demand for less restrictive and conventional garments. In fact, there was a movement spawned by the fact that, well, you can't really ride a bicycle very easily in a hoop skirt. That was actually called the sensible dress movement. At one point, Susan B. Anthony was said to have stated something to the effect that the bicycle has done more to improve the lives of women or to liberate women than any other thing I can think of. Not a poor endorsement indeed. Number 7. The Tour de France used to be done without gears. Yes, that's right. This massive race around the perimeter of a country, many stages of which go through mountains, was at one point done on single-speed bicycles. In fact, at one point it was done on fixed gears. Then they did go to freewheels, but the freewheels remained single freewheels. If you wanted to change the gears on your bicycle, you stopped your bike, you unbolted the rear wheel, and you flipped it around to the other side. Now, this is something that may still be familiar to people who ride track bikes or certain single-speed bikes to this day, but for most cyclists, this is an anachronism. And certainly nobody really thinks these days of doing the Tour de France on a bike with only one gear. However, at one point, that is exactly how it was done. Interestingly enough, the trend of doing the Tour de France on single-speed bikes persisted long after mechanical gear changing and derailleurs and multiple rear cogs were invented. The belief among some was that the bikes remained single-speed even when there was a geared alternative on the market, because the geared alternative was more complicated and they didn't trust to its durability. Other people have argued that Henry Descranes, the organizer of the race, was a sadistic so-and-so. That's neither here nor there. Number 8. The first race car drivers, some of them anyway, were former bike racers. Yes, that's right. Before race cars were a thing, or cars were really a thing, if you wanted to go really, really, really fast without riding on a horse or sitting on a train locomotive, what were your choices? Well, there was pretty much one, and it was ride a bicycle. It's no surprise that many people who are interested in speed and athletic endeavors became bicycle racers at the time. Now, of course, as technology developed into the practical automobile with the internal combustion engine, building in many ways on things that had been established in the first place for the bicycle, such as the inflatable tire, you saw the advent of automobiles and, in particular, automobile racing. Just like in many other sports, competition was seen not only as a way of promoting new products, but also as a way of working out the kinks in designs and testing what worked and what didn't and what were the advantages of certain mechanical contrivances. One of the first well-known race car drivers, Barney Oldfield, actually started life in the sport of racing as a bicycle racer. He was the first person to drive a car at faster than 60 miles an hour. Number 9. It has played a role in comics over the years, including some of the most popular ones. Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes is a favorite of many, many people in this country and throughout the world. I myself enjoyed it growing up, and I think many people still enjoy it to this day. It captures the innocent wonder of life, and also has a pretty wicked sense of humor, too. What most people don't realize, though, is that cycling has played a role in some of the major Calvin and Hobbes comic strips. Some put this down to the fact that the creator, Watterson, was a cyclist. Others simply see it as a way of commenting on some of the idiosyncrasies of the sport and the experience of people when they're attempting to learn how to ride a bicycle. Nevertheless, for those of us who are cyclists, these Calvin and Hobbes comic strips were a thing of great joy and something that are fondly remembered. And number 10. Way before Jackie Robinson, way before many of the other people who were seen as civil rights figures leading the way for equality in sports, you had a bike racer. Born in 1878, Marshall Major Taylor was a bicycle racer, in particular a track bike racer, at a time when bicycle racing was in arguably its heyday in America. He became the first black American to achieve the level of world champion and only the second African American person in the world to achieve the level of world champion in any sport. His career was marked with making great strides against racism, but he was poorly treated by many of his competitors, who in some cases didn't want to compete against him and in some cases sought to harm or impinge on him. Nevertheless, he's well remembered. There are cycling teams named after him, cycling clubs named after him. He was even the subject of a popular song. The irony, of course, is if you're not a cyclist, the thing is, well, who's Major Taylor? Which I think is pretty darn sad, because the irony is that, well, Major Taylor did a great deal to advance the idea that, you should be treated as a competitor regardless of what you look like, i.e. the idea of racial equality. The fact that he's no longer remembered is an indication that whatever strides we've made against racial bias, there definitely is a sort of cultural neglect of cycling. The fact that everybody knows the names of African American sports heroes who came after him, in some cases 50 years later, but nobody remembers the name Major Taylor unless they're a cyclist or hang out with cyclists, is a pretty sad commentary on the way things are going right now as far as people, actually paying attention to these sort of things. So, remember Major Taylor, people. Remember Major Taylor. Anyway, that's it. Lone Rider out. Just 10 things you may not know about cycling. Of course, if you're a cyclist, you probably know all these, but, if you're not, just something to think about. Stay cool, rock on.